Did you know that about 20% of new audience to any podcast comes from searches? Yes, people do search online for podcasts and click over to become new listeners for a podcast. But the question is, how do you rank on search engines and how do you show yourself up in front of people who are searching for your podcast? Podcast SEO is the answer to it. And in this episode, we'll be discussing more about podcast SEO and what you need to know about it. Listen till the end to learn a nice little tip on finding good keywords to optimize your podcast for. Welcome to the Podcasting University. Looking for help on starting your own podcast? Then this is the place to be. We will help you with everything from selecting your topic to promoting and monetizing your podcast in the simplest language possible. Listen to other podcasters who've been through the grind and learn from them as we interview them every week. You can find more details on thepodcastinguniversity.com. Hello and welcome to episode 72 of the Podcasting University. This is Dilip, and in this episode, you will learn a very important part in podcast searchability, which is podcast SEO. Now, search engines, especially Google, is a very important part of everything online. In fact, everything that we do online primarily starts with a search. In fact, the art of searching today is called as Googling. So, Google has become synonymous with search. No wonder that every website, video, and audio wants to be on the first page of Google, and that is one of the reasons why search engine optimization is one of the most sought after skills by web entrepreneurs or internet entrepreneurs. But then wait. The question is, can audio be on the first page of Google? That is exactly what we'll be talking about in this episode. This is part 1 on podcast SEO. I'll be releasing part 2 the next week. So don't forget to tune in the next week to listen to part 2 of this episode on podcast SEO. So let us first start by understanding how search works for audio. Now, search engines today have the capability of only searching through written text. They aren't capable enough to search through videos and audios. But search engines like Google still rank videos, and recently they've also started ranking audios, though not to the same extent as that of videos. But then the question is, how do they do it? It is pretty simple. They do it by converting video into textual form. That's right. By transcribing the audio in a video using automatic transcription, they have a textual format which they can then use to rank these videos on Google. Now, how do they know that a specific video is related to a specific search? For that, what they do is they look at specific words that the video is optimized for. Now again, the question is, how do they know that? Again, it is very simple. They check for specific words that are included in the accompanying texts in these videos, like for example, the video title, the description, the tags, etc., and then use that to rank these videos on Google. It is this exact same methodology that search engines follow in podcasting as well. Now, that explanation should be good enough for you to understand how search works. But before we get into more details about podcast SEO, let us also understand how can search help rank audio content or podcasts on Google. So let us look at some information about search engine rankings and how search engine rankings work and what is the relevance of search engine rankings in podcasting. Now, there are 4 primary ways in which search engine rankings can help your podcast get found. And the first one is these search engines rank podcast directories on their search results. So if your podcast is listed on any of these podcast directories and people are searching on Google with specific keyword terms, then the possibility of your podcast link on that specific podcast directory ranking on Google is very high. For example, let's take my show, The Podcasting University. Now, if you search for the name of the show, which is The Podcasting University on Google, you will find that the search results show my website as the first one, followed by my podcast link from Ghana.com. Then you will find the Apple Podcast link and then the Amazon Audible link. 3 of those links are from podcast directories: Ghana, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon. The first one is my website, but the other three are podcast directories. Now imagine if your podcast is listed on all of these podcast directories and somebody search for a specific keyword term that these podcast directories might show up on Google for, then the possibility of your show showing up on Google on the first page of Google is very high. So that's the first way your podcast can show up on Google search results. Now the second one is when your website shows up on search results. Now taking the same example, which is my podcast, the Podcasting University, you will notice that the first search result was my website. But then there are a few other search related terms, podcasting related search terms, for which I have optimized my website and for which my website shows up on search results. So people who are interested in learning about podcasting, when they search on Google with those specific terms, the likelihood of my podcast website showing up on Google is very high. And when people see that website on Google, the probability of them clicking on those links and going to my website and listening to the podcast is very high. Now, that's the second method. Now the third one is where Google Podcasts shows your podcast in the search results page if your podcast is on Google Podcasts. Now there are some very highly searched podcasting related terms for which my show, which is a Podcasting University, on Google Podcasts shows up as a first result when you search for it. So that gives me a lot of traffic through Google Podcasts. In fact, Google Podcast is the third most listened app for my podcast. And how are people coming and listening to my podcast on Google Podcasts? Maybe by using these search terms on Google. So it becomes very important that your podcast is there on Google Podcast and that your podcast is optimized for specific keyword terms that can show up on Google by way of Google Podcast when people are searching for those terms. Now, while we are understanding how the search engine rankings work, it is also important to understand another important aspect. Now, in addition to your podcast being ranked on Google searches, your individual episodes can also get ranked on the search results page on all the three fronts, which is podcasting directories, website, and Google Podcasts. Now, for example, I released an episode some time back, which was basically podcasting versus YouTube. And I got all the listeners coming in to listen to that episode through Google searches. And it is just because that podcasting versus YouTube episode on Google Podcasts shows up on the first page of Google. So you need to keep in mind that you have to optimize your podcast on two fronts. The first one is for your podcast as such, and second one is your every individual episode. Now at this point, there is another very important thing that you might want to note. YouTube is going to be big in podcasting. In fact, they have already started rolling out a dedicated podcast page. And YouTube is a search engine in itself where people search with keywords to find relevant videos. So it becomes important that your podcast is on YouTube and that you optimize your podcast for relevant YouTube search terms as well. Because once YouTube starts showing a podcast on their podcast page, the tendency of people searching on YouTube for content specific to some keywords might increase or might be high. And when they do that, you want your podcast to show up in front of them. So for that, you need to ensure that you're optimizing your podcast for YouTube relevant search terms as well. Now, let us understand a little more about SEO in general and podcast SEO in a little more specific and the role keywords can play in SEO. So, what is SEO or search engine optimization? Now, SEO or search engine optimization might sound like rocket science, but it isn't actually that difficult. In layman's terms, SEO involves adding signals to your content which makes it appear important enough to be ranked on Google by Google. Now let me once again reiterate that entire sentence. Now SEO involves adding signals to your content which makes it appear important enough to be ranked on Google by Google. So the question is, what are these signals and how will Google know about these signals? Now, these signals are nothing but texts or words that appear throughout the content. Now, these words are something that we call as keywords. Google sends its bot to skim through the textual content. And when it finds a specific keyword or text at important places in the content, What it does is it considers that piece of content as something that is relevant to that specific keyword or specific text. Now, for example, if you write a piece of content or an article about podcasting microphones, and that specific term, which is podcasting microphones, appears multiple times throughout the article, then Google will know that the article is about podcasting microphones. So when somebody searches for that term on Google, Google will prefer to show your article in their search results. So what is SEO or search engine optimization? In simple terms, SEO is about two things. One is identifying those specific text or keywords or terms, and two, adding them at those important places that I just spoke about. And that's it. That's a simple explanation of search engine optimization. If you are able to do these two things, then you can say that you've optimized your content for search engines. Now that was specific to textual content. So how does podcast SEO work? And is it any different from textual SEO? Absolutely not. Podcast SEO is exactly the same thing. The only difference is that we will be attaching a textual piece to our audio or our podcast, which will then be crawled by the Google bots, and based on what they find, they will decide if they want to rank your content on Google or not. Podcast SEO follows the exact same principles. So the two steps in podcast SEO will be: one, finding the right keywords, and two, adding these keywords at those important places, which I'll be discussing in a few minutes from now. So, number one, finding the right keywords. Now, this is probably the most important and the slightly difficult step in search engine optimization. But then what do you mean by right keywords and how do you find them? There are three things that you need to keep in mind in order to find the right keywords. The first one is that it should be something that your audience might be searching for. Number two, it should have a decent search volume, meaning there should be some amount of people who are searching for it, or there should be some amount of searches for that specific keyword. And number three, it should have low competition. So now the question is, how do you find keywords that satisfy all of these three categories? There are a lot of online tools that you can use to find these keywords. And one of the simplest, easiest, and also free tool is Ubersuggest. So I would recommend using this tool. It is Ubersuggest. You'll be able to find a link in the show notes for this episode. It is ubersuggest.com. Now, all you need to do is enter a primary keyword into the tool, and it will show you a list of keywords derived from that specific primary keyword and or related to it, along with the search volume and the competition. Then you can go ahead and pick the ones that suits you the most or meets the criteria that we spoke about, which is which keyword that people are searching for, which has decent amount of volume, and which has low competition. And that's it. You can do a simple competition check by going to these different podcast directories like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, etc. And also go to Google and search for that specific keywords if you want to see how many podcasts rank for that specific keyword. Then check how many podcasts are showing up and how are they using those terms in their show names, episode names, etc. You might want to note all of this down because this will help you optimize your content for that specific term, and it will serve as a guidance in optimizing your content. Now that we've understood how podcast SEO and search engine optimization in general works, let us move on to the next step, which is optimizing your show for search engines, which is something that we'll do in the next step. But that we'll keep for the next episode. So don't forget to come back the next week when I'll be talking more about optimization techniques to get your show ranked on Google search results. And now on to the simple tip that I promised. So here's what you need to do. Pick keywords that are at least 3 words long. These are called as long tail keywords, which basically 3 words or more. So you can pick these long tail keywords. How you do it is first search using the primary keyword on Apple Podcasts or maybe google.com. Then find variants of these keywords with less competition that are 3 words or more in number. Then use these keywords in your podcast and episode titles. Your podcast episodes will rank pretty easily on Google, and I'll show you how to do that in the next episode. Don't forget to tune in the next Tuesday and listen to episode number 73, where I'll be continuing this conversation on podcast SEO. I hope you enjoyed this episode on podcast SEO. If you did, then you might want to visit thepodcastinguniversity.com for the show notes and the resources. And also, if you would like to get started with your podcast, you might want to join the free 10-day e-course on the Podcasting University about getting started with your own podcast. If you have any questions, you can leave a comment in there and I'll respond to those comments. The Podcasting University is available on pretty much all podcasting platforms, including Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Prime Music, Stitcher, and Gaana as well. Pick your favorite platform and give it a listen in there. And if you like the show, then don't forget to subscribe to the show in order to stay updated with the latest episodes. That is all that I have for this week. I'll be back again the next week, continuing with the conversation about podcasting SEO. Until then, keep listening to the Podcasting University, and you have a wonderful rest of the week.